Let's review some of those important terminologies that we have talked so far. I need to actually do a slideshow. Here you go. All right. So we talked about what language is, and we talked about the 5 important components of language. The 5 important components of language were morphology, semantics, syntax, phonology, and pragmatics. We talked about speech, how speech is one of a primary ways of vocally communicating language. So language is a set of rules or something, or symbols, or which is rule governed, that helps us communicate in a certain way. And language can be written language, sign language, spoken language, which is where speech comes into picture. And when we talked about the terminologies, we said there are some prerequisites of speech production, and those include a source, which is nothing but the air from your lungs, vibrator, your vocal folds serve as your vibrator, and when the sound from your vibrator needs to go to the listener, then you need a medium, and for most speech purposes, air becomes our medium. We also talked about some of the properties of the medium that includes inertia and elasticity. Right? Then we talked about how what a pressure or a sound wave is. If you trace the movement of one particle, then it becomes a pressure wave or a sound wave. And there are different ways to measure this pressure wave and sound wave. It includes temporal and spatial measures. Temporal meaning time and spatial meaning in space. Now, temporal measures include period and frequency. Period is the time taken to complete one cycle, and frequency is the number of cycles per second. And wavelength is the distance that a cycle completes, right? The distance taken to travel one cycle. And you have to understand here what is important. You've also done some of those exercises in your first terminologies lecture. What I want you to know is frequency, period, and wavelength are reciprocal to each other, meaning if frequency increases, period decreases, and wavelength decreases. And if frequency decreases, period and wavelength increase. So that was pretty much what we talked about in our first terminologies lecture. So today we're going to talk about, in this lecture, something about simple waves and complex waves. And why is this important to talk about simple waves and complex waves? Simple waves and complex waves will help us understand how to study speech sounds. Where does speech fall into, and how does it help us to study speech sounds? Alright, unfortunately, I do not have the tuning fork which I had from last class, and I wish I had because I had to borrow it from our audiologist. And I'm recording this lecture at 4:30 in the evening, and they're all not gone. So hopefully I should be able to convey that concept and without you being able to hear that tuning fork sound. Okay. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a sinusoid. If you remember when we talked about a waveform and we traced a pressure wave, we talked about, I said, keep this concept in mind, and we're going to talk about this soon because this is something like a simple wave. So a sinusoid also can be called as a simple wave, also can be called as a sine wave, repeats itself in exactly the same way, and it has a constant number of cycles. So the period is going to be the same, right? If you look at this tracing right here, right? This is the exact same way. Oops, excuse me. This is the exact same way. It's repeating itself, right? And it has a predictable pattern. It consists of just one specified frequency, because you know the number of cycles completed in 1 second is the frequency. So that is a tuning fork. So if I hit that, that wave that gets transmitted is of the same frequency, and it repeats itself in the exact same way. It is the simplest of all sound waves, but unfortunately, it's not something we hear in everyday life. How often do we keep hearing a single tone when we walk on the road or when we are in our office listening to music? So sinusoid is a very simple wave. It's also called a sine wave. It's a sound or the wave that results when you hit a tuning fork, okay? And it's not something that we listen to in everyday life. Now, when we trace the sinusoidal wave, that is a sinusoidal wave, a simple wave, or a sine wave. And I wish I could write those 3 names right here for you, but just bear with me, all right? So the motion, if you talk about, remember we talked about a pendulum, we talked about a swing, an arc of a swing. If I were to move my swing from the center position and it moves in one direction, then comes back to the center position, doesn't stop there because of inertia, moves back in the other direction. If I trace that one movement of that one cycle, that becomes sine wave. And it's like a wave trace of a pendulum or a swing or tuning fork. Or if you remember from the first lecture how I moved the mouse, and if I trace that movement of the mouse, that becomes one sine wave. Okay, it is characterized by a smooth, repetitive oscillation. And the tone that results from a sine wave, if I generated a sine wave on a computer, usually we use it in speech purposes, we call it an oscilloscope, a cathode ray oscilloscope. If I generated a sine wave on that oscilloscope and I played that oscilloscope, I will listen to a tone that's called a pure tone because it consists just that one frequency. So all I hear is that one frequency sound, and that one frequency sound becomes a pure tone. All right. So a simple harmonic motion will result in a sinusoidal wave. That is, if you trace a pendulum or a swing or even the sound of a tuning fork, that becomes a sinusoidal wave or a simple wave or a sine wave. It's a simplest form of vibration. It has a very characteristic smooth repetitive pattern, and whatever sound that results from a simple wave is pure tone. All right. There are three important features or characteristics to determine a pure tone, and those characteristics are frequency. We know what a frequency is, which is number of cycles per second, and amplitude, and that is nothing but the magnitude of displacement, and phase. So we know these two concepts, frequency and amplitude. Frequency for a sine wave is just one frequency. It repeats itself in the exact same way, and so it has only one specified frequency. The amplitude could be same or different for that frequency. It can be a high amplitude or a low amplitude, meaning it can be a high volume sound or a low volume sound. And phase is nothing but the position of a sine wave relative to some arbitrary reference position. All right. That means if I were to talk about the position of that particle relative to another position. So let's talk about, say, the particle at rest position. If that particle travels to a point of maximum displacement in one direction compared to the rest position, so let's see if I can show this. Okay, here, if I were to say that this is the rest position, right, this is set at 0 degrees, okay. Now the particle, when it travels to this position, it's at 90 degrees relative to the position of the particle at rest. When the particle comes back to this position, it is at 180 degrees relative to the particle when at rest at 0 degrees. Here at 270 degrees, here at 360 degrees. So you get that point? How you're talking about the phase being relative position of the particle, the position of or the point that the particle has moved relative to another position. Okay? So, phase is defined as a portion of the cycle through which the molecules have passed up to a given instant in time. It is important to know what is the timing relationship between these sine waves. Okay? Why is phase important? When we look at two sine waves, where you look here, you see that this, what you see up, is a crest, and this, what you see down, is a trough, right? Just like in a wave, when we talk about the tides of waves, the crest of the wave and the trough of the wave. This is the crest and this is the trough, right? When the crest and crest, or the trough and trough, occur in the exact same time, right, relative to the rest position, then these waves are called in phase. Okay? Now, if I sum up these two waves that are in phase, I'm going to get a very high amplitude. They're going to increase in amplitude when compared to a wave that is out of phase when the crest occurs at opposite times and the trough occurs at opposite times. The crest, one is a crest, one is a trough. Now, if I add these two waves, I'm going to get no sound. These sine waves are called out of phase. Okay. So sine waves are in phase and out of phase. Phase is the movement of a particle at a given point in time compared to a relative position or a rest position. So if this was 0 degrees and if the particle moved here, that particle's position is at 90 degrees compared to this position. And then the waves can be in phase or out of phase. When the crest occurs at the same time, they're in phase, and when the trough occurs at the same time, they're in phase. But when the crest and trough occur at opposite times, then they're called out of phase, sine waves out of phase. Okay, so three parameters that are important to understand a sine wave are the frequency, which we know it's going to be one specified frequency because it's the same number of cycles that get repeated. Your your amplitude, which can be same or different amplitude of the sound. And the third is going to be the phase, whether the sine waves are occurring in phase or out of phase. All right. So now from simple wave, we're going to talk to something called a complex tone, right? So simple, if we summarize the simple wave, it's got one specified frequency, it has a repeatable pattern, it occurs in the exact same way, so it's periodic. Okay, it has a predictable pattern. And there are three features to it, and in the sound that results from a simple wave is a pure tone, and the simple wave can also be called as a sine wave or a sinusoidal wave. Okay. Now, complex tone is energy is concentrated in more than one frequency. So if I were to add, this is one pure tone, frequency at 100 Hertz. This is a second pure tone, which is frequency of 300 Hertz. This is a third pure tone with a frequency of 500 Hertz. Now, if I add together these three pure tones, I get a resultant tone, which is purple color here that you see. That is a complex tone. It is energy is concentrated in more than one frequency. Remember, a simple tone has only one specified frequency. Here, a complex tone has more than one frequency where I added three different pure tones to get a resultant complex wave. But this waveform has a repeating pattern. If you keep adding, this waveform will continue the same way, just like it. Okay. Periodicity. So a complex wave can be a periodic wave or an aperiodic wave. A complex periodic wave, meaning there is continuous oscillation that is producing the same frequency. It has a movement that repeats itself. That is what periodic is. So a simple tone is periodic because the movement repeats itself in exactly a predictable manner. So a complex periodic wave is also something which is producing a similar frequency. So if a complex periodic wave is a resultant frequency of three different frequencies, it produces the same frequency and it repeats itself in the exact same manner. Now, a periodic wave is also said to be harmonically related. What does that mean? What does harmonics mean? Okay. Harmonics are nothing but whole number integer multiples of the lowest frequency of pattern repetition or fundamental frequency. A fundamental frequency can be represented by FO. Okay, I don't have it here on the slide. Oh, I do. I'm sorry, my bad. Right here. What you see right here is FO. That is the way we represent fundamental frequency. So if you remember how we define fundamental frequency, it's the lowest component frequency with which your vocal folds vibrate freely, right, in terms of our speech production. So if your fundamental frequency is 100 Hertz, which is the first frequency of pattern repetition, you will see whole number integer multiples of that 100 Hertz for the different harmonics. So if the first harmonic of fundamental frequency is 100 Hertz, the whole number integer multiples of that will be second harmonic is times 2, third harmonic is times 3, fourth harmonic is times 4, fifth harmonic is times 5, and so on. Okay. Now, if you took a fundamental frequency of 200 Hertz, which is your first harmonic, then your second will be times 2. 200 times 2 is 400. 200 times 3, third harmonic is 600, and so on. So you can see how harmonics is nothing but whole number integer multiples of that lowest frequency or the fundamental frequency. If you think about an example here would be a string instrument. When you play a string instrument, you don't just hear the one frequency. There are different frequencies that you hear associated with that. Those different frequencies are the harmonics. So if you're talking about periodicity, is you have a lowest fundamental frequency and then you have different fundamental frequencies, different frequencies that are harmonics of that fundamental frequency, okay, and the pattern repeats itself. That is a complex periodic wave. So if you look at that, that is your harmonic 1, which is the highest peak, and you can call that as your fundamental frequency. And then are the other harmonics. Here you see harmonic 3 and harmonic 5. You don't see harmonics 2 and 4. Okay, so that is a complex periodic wave. You can see it's like a saw waveform, and that repeats itself in the exact same manner. So that is a complex wave. Okay. Now, some of the features of harmonics are harmonics is a characteristic of a complex periodic signal. So if you see a periodic signal, you should be able to see the harmonics. Only for complex waves. For simple waves, you do not see harmonics. The reason being, simple wave is just one frequency. Alright, simple wave is just one frequency, and you will not be able to see harmonics of that one frequency. But if it's a complex wave, a complex periodic wave, you have the lowest frequency, also called the fundamental frequency, and then you have the harmonics, which are integer multiples, whole number integer multiples of that lowest frequency. Another characteristic of the harmonics is there is a decrease in amplitude with increase in frequency. So if you go back to this figure, you see how the harmonics decrease in amplitude as the frequency increases. That is a characteristic of a harmonic. And we also have to know that higher harmonics are less important for human speech. As the harmonics increase in frequency, the amplitude decreases, and they're not as important for us to understand human speech. Okay, so reiterate. A complex tone is energy concentrated in more than one frequency. A complex tone can be periodic or aperiodic, and so far we have just talked about the periodic signal. Periodicity is when it repeats itself in the exact same manner and it's harmonically related. So to understand that, we need to know what harmonics are. Harmonics are whole number integer multiples of your lowest frequency, which is also called the fundamental frequency. And so, for example, if your first harmonic is 100 hertz, your second harmonic is twice that, your third harmonic is 3 times that, your fourth harmonic is 4 times that. Similarly, if you do a first harmonic at 200 hertz, your second harmonic is twice 200 hertz, your third harmonic is three times 200 hertz, and so forth. The energy at each component frequency here is discrete. Okay? And those are some of the characteristics of harmonics. So here what you see is a visual representation showing the fundamental frequency of 100 hertz. It's harmonic, so you can see 200, 300. This visual representation is called a spectrum. What you see right here, it says spectrum, and we will talk about what spectrum is in a little bit when I talk about how to visualize a waveform. But what I want you to observe here is that's the fundamental frequency which has the highest amplitude. Those are the harmonics, whole number integer multiples, and how there is a decrease in amplitude as there is increase in frequency. All right. So what is aperiodicity? A periodic sound wave is one in which the vibration is random. So for example, if I did this, that is noise. I just hit on the table, right? I'll do it one more time. That is an aperiodic sound wave because each time I do that, we don't know what frequency there is to that sound. We don't know if they're harmonic related, and there is no fundamental frequency. There is nothing that has a repeatable pattern. So an aperiodic complex wave is one where the vibration is random. There is no repeatable pattern. You can't predict the pattern of noise. There is no period or no fundamental frequency, and it is not harmonically related. Okay, so that is an aperiodic wave. So a complex wave can be periodic and a complex wave can be aperiodic. An aperiodic wave is something that has no repeatable pattern and the vibration is random in that, and they're harmonically unrelated. So this is an example of a complex aperiodic waveform. Okay, so if you look at that, you can see that there is no repeatable pattern here. Look at it, so random. There's something that I cannot predict. There is no fundamental frequency. There is no harmonics that I can see. So this is an example of a complex aperiodic waveform. So the differences between periodic and aperiodic is periodic is harmonically related. It has a repeatable pattern. Okay. And aperiodic, the vibration is random. It has no repeatable pattern and it is not harmonically related. So having talked about all of this complex wave, simple wave, our concern for this semester is speech, right? So where does this lead us? Is speech a periodic or an aperiodic wave? Now, so I want you to think through this slide. I want you to think yourself whether speech is periodic or aperiodic. Then go into the discussion board, and if you can find that answer, fine, or post what you think about whether speech is periodic or aperiodic, and then we can have a discussion on module 2 about this. Okay? All right. This is one example. Here not example, this is a table that summarizes periodic and aperiodic wave. A simple wave is one component frequency, it's a pure tone, it's periodic. Complex can be periodic and aperiodic. Complex wave is two or more component frequencies, and periodic is they're harmonically related. They have a fundamental frequency and harmonics. Aperiodic is two or more component frequencies, they're not harmonically related, no fundamental frequency, no harmonics. An example would be noise. All right. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to stop right now, and then I'll come back and talk about the attributes of sound and how do we visualize the sound. All right.